Good morning. Delighted that you're all here. As Kara said, we made that challenge last year, and it's amazing that we've made so much progress aligning all these groups. And we were lucky. Eric, I interviewed his wife, Jen Cole, who's the Jordan Schnitzer director of PNCA, the president, and I said, hey, what about your husband? And learned that he'd been on the city council in Nashville and then headed up their homeless program for 4 years and then worked at Arizona State University with outreach programs too. And I thought, boy, we need someone with his kind of expertise to help us focus our efforts. So we're delighted that Eric came to Portland and joined us. In terms of this group, Kara already said it, for most of you that just drove here this morning and came down 4th, I mean, you think I feel like I was in Detroit 6 or 7 or 8 years ago. There's no reason for these issues to be here. You know, sometimes I think we overcomplicate everything. These are not difficult problems to solve. We have fabulous role models of things that Alan's going to tell us about and other providers. But for some reason, we had the unlucky situation where we had just a combination of ineffective leadership at the city, the county, a DA that doesn't want to prosecute. I mean, the stars were just misaligned. Okay, we have fabulous solutions to these problems. I'm not saying that execution isn't complicated, but in terms of knowing what to do, they're wonderful role models we're going to hear about today. So hopefully with this group, we've organized ourselves. There should be 200 or 300 people here, but this is a great start. The question is, can this group now harness its energy, its leadership, its members, to be effective in helping create change? That's going to be our challenge. If we just keep talking about the issue, then we're doing nothing other than just collectively talking about what we all talk about individually. So this is a fabulous start today for all of you who've come here. And Karen, Evan, you've been wonderful leaders, Tom, others, but we've got to take the energy we have and the lessons we're going to hear about today in the models and figure out how we channel that more effectively to our leaders and ourselves as to what we should do. So thanks for coming, thanks for being involved, and if we don't do something, if we don't help be that truism, part of the solution, then we just continue to be part of the problem. And it's just intolerable, okay? There's no community in this country that we look at from a real estate standpoint and admire that doesn't have a vital downtown. Now, all of us in the business here, our suburbs are doing great here, as they are in our other 7 markets too. But it is embarrassing, it is scary, and it's just not right for our downtown to be in the malaise that it is, and for its gangrene to have gone out into the suburbs with tents and the chop shops and whatever throughout Lombard and all over the city. So we have the ability to make a difference if we can figure out how to channel ourselves and communicate effectively and be a beacon and role model with other providers too to make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you all. Can you hear me okay? Thank you, Jordan. Really appreciate your message as we get started. We're not just going to talk, we're going to act today, and this is kind of our idea of laying the groundwork so everybody can kind of be somewhat on the same page. I first got involved with this group over Zoom when I was still in Arizona. Got to meet Jordan, got to meet Tom Ped, who you're going to meet here in just a second, as well as the other steering committee members. And I'm amazed at the dedication and the compassion that this group operates with. So appreciate all of you, appreciate the spirit. I will say, in the 2 cities I've been previously, if I could have gathered a group of business leaders like you all in a room with this much heart and this much dedication, I would have been thrilled. So I actually do feel like the conditions are right in Portland to be able to do something really, really special. And I'm excited you're going to get hear from some service providers today who can kind of tell the story. I think we all know that a response needs to be really person-centered, right? And that we have a lot of challenges in front of us, but our goal today is to really get towards a place where we can all kind of come together around solutions and help provide ways for you all to plug in, and because it's going to take all of us to work through what's a pretty complex issue. Okay. This is not going to be long, I really promise. The first slide is heavy, but we wanted to give you just a perspective. And so in Multnomah, in our point-in-time count, which is the best available count of individuals experiencing homelessness, this is the latest data. So you've probably seen this in the news, 6,600 people in all 3 counties. The bulk of those are in Multnomah County. And we have a very large unsheltered population versus a sheltered population, and then a transitional housing population. I think the most alarming figure here is our 50% increase in unsheltered people since 2019. That's a trend that no city wants to see, and unfortunately that's what Portland's experiencing. People of color face significantly disproportionate rates of homelessness. The system is trying to figure out how to cope with that and deal with it, but it's a long struggle too. These are the numbers for Washington County as well as Clackamas County. A little better on the sheltered versus unsheltered, smaller populations. This is an interesting data point that we found as we were starting our work. This is Oregon's proportion of unsheltered and chronically homeless. Now, this is a couple of years old, unfortunately, but we think it's fairly accurate. So what you can see here is the general population percentage for Oregon is somewhere, 1.4, 1.5% of the overall national population. As you go up the chart, those are percentages that Oregon holds for each one of those categories. So this is a significant issue, not just Portland, not just Oregon, not just the West Coast. It is an issue that is everywhere, but disproportionately, Oregon has a really strong challenge in that we have a larger group of the population. So there's that pit count, and then we're really talking more about 24,000 or so households across the region. That includes a whole bunch of different subgroups that are impacted. Some of the things we'll talk about today and some of the solution pieces are listed on this list. Not going to go through all of them. I think the main message from this is it takes all of these things. It takes a continuum of services, of housing, of supports, of shelter to get to that long-term goal of having people permanently housed and self-sufficient. So that's a lot. It's a lot of things that go into it. And so a system has to operate. Just real fast, I thought I'd show you, these are some of the budget numbers that exist. This is where I have great hope for optimism in that we have some huge chunks of money that are currently being put into the system, that are being spooled up as well. So that ought to, and this doesn't include, this is not at all a comprehensive list. And we'll share this deck with you. City of Portland's expenditures have been higher this year than any year in the past at $85 million. This last slide I'll show you just because this is actually one I did for the previous city I was in Phoenix. This chart, and there's even yellow ones over here, this shows all of the organizations and agencies that are nonprofit or faith-based or governmental or federal that are working on this issue. I mean, it's a huge spider chart, and we haven't done one for Portland. I think it would probably be bigger. If there's nothing else you take away from today, the thing that my experience has taught me is the solution is in us operating as a functioning system to end and resolve homelessness rather than a collection of just different programs. And money can do a lot, but you also have to have coordination, data, analysis working constantly to measure and track the problem. So one of the things we wanted to do today was talk about more of these root cause issues as opposed to more of the kind of quality of life, street level issues that we all experience. Those will come up. We hope you will bring them up. We hope we can discuss those as well. They're very important. But I think the power of this group as they've come together is in these longer term solutions working together. So that was part of our goal, to assemble some folks that could help you move forward on that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom Ped, who is the chair of our homelessness subcommittee and has done a phenomenal job pulling us all together over the last 9 months. Tom's a local attorney, and he's just a really, really great guy, and I really enjoy working with him.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm Tom Ped. I'm from the law firm of Williams Kastner. I'm here to moderate the three fabulous panelists we have here. And I saw today as a way for our group we need to form our game plan because we want to make change happen. And we want to accomplish that through a bunch of different ways, lobbying and other ways, but we have to have our game plan first. And to do that, we have to have some data, we have to have some information to back up what we say when we go out and start debating these issues with policymakers and other people who have a lot of knowledge on these issues. The good news is today, I just saw that we only have $600 million to work with, so I think we can get there. We have three panelists today, and I'm going to have them introduce themselves. Alan Evans from Bobby Lakes Hope Center. Do you want to say a few things about yourself, Alan?
Yeah, my name's Alan Evans, and I'm the founder and executive director of Helping Hands Reentry Outreach Centers. Working with Jordan on the Bobby Lakes Hope Center. Here we've got 12 facilities around 5 Oregon counties, and we house about 600 people a night.
Rich Vial, an attorney from Portland.
My name's Rich Vial. I serve on the United in Spirit group, which is a group of ecumenical organizations. I happen to be the government affairs chair for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We've got a group of Christian, Muslim, Jewish, and other faith-based organizations that we've been meeting for about 2 years. And we have been hearing from leaders in the community, law enforcement in the community, state leaders, et cetera, about the problem and what they believe the solution is. And I'm looking forward today to talking a little bit more about what we think our conclusions are after that.
Thanks, Rich. And Bob Day. Bob Day's background is with the Portland Police Bureau. You have a history there. Why don't you tell us about yourself a little bit?
Yeah, good morning. My name is Bob Day. I retired from the Police Bureau in 2019. I had a 30-year career in law enforcement. Started in '88 with the Oregon State Police. Native Oregonian and native Portlander. In 2020, I went to work in the mayor's office for a year. I don't tell a lot of people that because it didn't appear I was very successful, but I did try to help Ted and the team out during that tumultuous time. And then I've spent about the last year and a half or two engaged with various projects around behavioral health, criminal justice, both locally and nationally, trying to offer some expertise and some experience and background to help folks out.
And is it for your own safety that we're not supposed to tell folks that you referee football? Is that how that works?
Yeah, Tom and I might make a sidetrack, but I also officiate football in the Pac-12 conference. So on the weekends in the fall, I'm out on the football field. My wife wonders why I took a career that had conflict and then I took an avocation that had conflict. So I must have something about conflict that I'm comfortable in. But anyway.
We're going to have a special session after this session with Bob for that. All right, so the idea today is to educate ourselves and to learn. And we have an hour and 15 minutes blocked off for these gentlemen to speak, and then we have another time set for questions. But in talking, we're considering just kind of opening it up as people are talking. If questions come up, we'd like to turn this into a conversation as much as possible. But to start things, I'd like to start with you, Alan. You've got the most compelling story in the room, I think. If you could please start out talking about what are the causes of homelessness and what are the trends that you're seeing now?
Well, the fastest growing population of homeless that we see today is senior citizens, and the second fastest growing population is mothers with children. And I believe that the core issues of trauma are trauma, which we don't look at it that way. We're not dealing with this issue in a trauma-informed manner. I lived on the streets for 27 years, from the age of 13. I was hung by my father when I was 11. I was put in the hospital multiple times. I was a full-blown methamphetamine addict by the time I was 13. Every decision I made came from what I lived through when I was young. We don't look at, we become problem-centered. We see this problem growing and growing and growing, and we attempt to solve the problem by throwing money at it the wrong way. We're not collecting the proper data that we need to collect to serve this population correct.
I mean, you have people coming into your facility, and we're going to talk about Bobby Lake some more. When you say trauma, like what kinds of things are you seeing with people?
Well, just in the pandemic alone, we've seen a 9% increase in domestic violence. If the only kind of services we provide in a community are low barrier shelters, a senior just falling out of the system, being pushed into the same environment where everybody's attempting to survive, we start to see an increase in bigger issues. What we're seeing now is, we have people in our facilities with master's degrees who have student loan debt and have fallen out of the system, and everybody coming to us has a different set of issues because everybody has a different story. And if we're only dealing with, for me, for instance, and I'll use myself as an example, I went to treatment 9 times because I was a drug addict, and I'd go to treatment 30, 45-day program, and they would release me into the same environment that I was living in before. 56% of the people who come through our door have addiction issues, and the average number of time that they've been to treatment is 5. 34% of the people who come to us are diagnosed with a mental illness, and less than 4% of those people are being treated in communities. We provide those services in our communities, but it's unreachable for the people that are trying to get it.
Rich Vial wrote a really great op-ed in the Beaverton Valley Times in March of 2022, and I'm going to quote from it in a little bit. But one of the concepts that Rich talked about is siloed agencies. That's a term that you used in your op-ed, Rich. Can you talk a little bit about what you meant by that?
Well, Tom, you heard Alan talk a minute ago about statistics. And Alan's got statistics. His system and his program really does keep track of individual people. Unfortunately, no one else in our system is doing that. And so what we have are numerous agencies. What are there, 19 agencies in Portland alone that potentially could deal with this issue, something like that?
Well, there's 19 city bureaus, but there has to be multiple more organizations and agencies dealing with it.
If you count the nonprofits, et cetera. And we have used the term siloed. These agencies, these nonprofits, these organizations that are all well-meaning are not working with one another. And I can talk a little bit later, Tom, about some of the solutions we think we have identified to that, but clearly that is the problem.
So, Alan, you talked about kind of being treated and spit out. Is that because there is an integration of the different services? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, I looked at this two different ways. I looked at it from the bottom up because I always tried to get services. And I look at it in the business today from the top down, or serving people. And the view is completely different from what we think. So silo is exactly what's happening. At the very end for me, I tried to get food stamps. They told me I needed identification. I tried to get identification. They told me I needed a residence. I wanted a residence, but I had no money. And at that particular moment in my life, I realized that crime was a win-win situation. I could commit a crime, support my habit, and live the same lifestyle I was living. And if I got arrested, I'd get 3 meals and a bed in jail. That was a common thing. That's exactly what I did. I used emergency rooms, anything I could to stay self-medicated to get what I needed. I could not receive mental health services. I couldn't make the appointments. I couldn't move my tent. I couldn't get to someplace. We have a funding stream that comes into our state that everybody is applying to get. And so all these agencies are siloed because they're driven by these dollars that get released into the communities. And working together while we're all competing for the same pot of money is extremely hard to do. And we lose people between agency and agency.
And then you mentioned earlier you would go to addiction treatment, and then what would happen? Was there any coordination did they help you with job skills or housing or anything like that?
No, because they provided one service. I could go to detox. I'd go to a minor aftercare where I get a 30-day stay. They would say, okay, here's your certificate. You've done well. You've graduated treatment. And then you'd have to go back out into the same environment. I lived on the streets. I'd go to whatever was left of my camp or my tent, and hoping that I could survive and not use. And then I was also stuck with what was between my ears, because I was the trauma was never dealt with. The deeper issues or any of the other obstacles I faced to reenter society weren't dealt with. I got one service.
Tom, something that Alan said made me think this may be worth sharing with folks. Our group has been hearing from all these leaders. And so in October of last year, and then again in December, we convened these sort of summit meetings where we brought all these folks in. And the idea was, let's get them all together and talk with one another. And the reality was that it was clear in those conversations that the money really was driving everybody apart. The siloing was happening because no one, and these are all well-meaning people. They all want to do the right thing. They all want to serve these folks that they have genuine compassion for, but they're all convinced that their system is the best system, and if they could just get their system scaled up, it would be the solution. And what we came away from that with the conclusion is that that just isn't going to work.
And can you give any examples of one type of agency thinking that they need all the money, basically, or they need to have priority versus somebody else?
Well, I don't want to malign any particular organization, but I will tell you that as a general matter, housing first was a concept that was very popular among a number of these groups. And housing first was the idea that we just need to build our way out of this. If we build enough houses, then rents will go down because there's more competition, et cetera, et cetera. And so initially, a lot of this money was allocated specifically to build housing. Well, as we all know, that was a pretty inefficient system. We didn't build near enough houses to become even close to solving the problem. And so we came away again with the conclusion that housing first being the primary focus of many of these organizations was a big part of the problem.
Bob, can you talk about what was the experience and what were the practices of law enforcement, say 10 to 20 years ago, in dealing with these issues, and how have things changed now, if they have?
Yeah, so, and I just echo the comments I've heard here already this morning, and appreciate Jordan's comments. I've said oftentimes that this isn't complicated. It is the execution that's hard, but we do have success models. We do have programs out there that have worked. Unfortunately, we walked away from some of those for a variety of reasons and decisions made. In my career, I spent a great deal of my time assigned to Central Precinct. I was in the Mounted Patrol Unit in the 90s, and then Central Precinct Commander in 2011 when Occupy Portland hit. I tell Sam Adams I'm still in counseling for that. You know, I have an extensive time of working in law enforcement around the challenges of public safety. And when it comes to these conversations to deal with homelessness, houselessness, people living on our streets, you know, in the 90s, the approach was very much enforcement oriented. One thing that we should know is we have plenty of laws on the books to address the behaviors and issues we're talking about. I'm not suggesting that is the correct manner to go about. I'm also fully recognize that our system has not always been just and fair and equitable to everyone. So that's a separate symposium, I'm sure, but the reality is these laws do exist. There are tools available if we were to choose an enforcement approach, which was the attitude primarily in the 90s. We addressed what we called high-impact camping back then, the really obvious large campsites, tents, et cetera, believing that interrupting that cycle through law enforcement, you know, prevented people from really setting down stakes and having long-term impact, long-term detriment to the community. There's a lot of things that have changed over the years in terms of our view of the justice system, our use of the justice system. There's, you know, a lot of good reasons to not have enforcement be the tip of the spear in this conversation, but that was an approach that we had. In the early mid-2000s, and you remember under the Charlie Hale's administration, they proposed the safe sleep idea. And that was really, in my opinion, the beginning of kind of ebbing away from using enforcement as a tool, but more how do we create spaces for people to be able to sleep and stay in the public space. And I tell people that policing's job is to provide safety in the public space for all members of the community. And that's what we do. We manage the public space. And so as we began to make exceptions to the rules, then we begin to see the increased amount of conflict because now you have a greater degree of subjectivity in who can stay where for how long, or how much, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, we're all human beings, whether it's police officers, judges, DAs, community members, people living on the streets. So there's complexity there in that system. But we began to move away from what would be traditional rule of law, order maintenance, or expectations, and creating a greater space for other types of behaviors. And there's, you know, we can talk about prosecuting decisions. We can talk about lack of police services, et cetera, but from a criminal justice standpoint, essentially have moved away from that as an instrument. And I'll end with, once again, it's probably a different symposium, but I do believe that we have overutilized police in our nation's history to suppress problems versus really addressing problems. I think you've heard that from both these men already this morning. We've defaulted to the police. I've participated in that. I've led that. This is not a condemnation of policing. I'm immensely proud to have been a Portland police officer and still believe very strongly in that profession. But I think that broader conversation and understanding of where we see the criminal justice system fitting into this, because it does have a role, is very, very significant.
So some time ago, what resources were available for law enforcement when someone's having a crisis out in the street?
Well, I mean, if you go back when I started, you had institutions such as Damish, for example. We took people to Damish, the mental institution down in Wilsonville. And, institutions closed, once again, for a lot of good reasons. This is not a good, bad, or a criticism or a praise of any one decision or organization. I think we are failing to recognize, though, these decisions have consequences. And if you're going to close all of these large mental institutions that house people who are in behavioral health crisis and then not create alternatives in the community, the belief was we're now going to fund alternatives within the community. That didn't happen. So the police, who have the authority to take people into custody for a civil hold on 2 occasions, they can take them into custody when they're intoxicated and unable to care for themselves, and they can take them into custody when they're a danger to themselves or others. This is state law. It's common across the country. And the police can make that decision, a mental health provider can make that decision, a doctor can make that decision. There are certain people that are given that authority. It's a civil commitment to where they get held for up to 72 hours, get evaluated, hopefully, as Alan mentioned, get into some type of program or assistance. Well, the default became emergency rooms. The default became jail, because it's easier to take somebody to jail than it is to take them to an emergency room where you're going to sit for 4 to 6 to 8 hours. So if you have a minor crime, we'll just go to jail. Well, we understand when people go into jail, the consequences of that, the decisions of having a record, and how that impacts things later down the road. So the loss of the opportunity of adequate places to be able to take people who are in crisis is paramount. And then this was magnified in 2019, 2020, when the Hooper Detox Center closed. As you may be aware, Central City Concern ran a sobering center over in Northeast Portland. And sobering meaning not detox, it was called Hooper Detox, but it was really more just about getting people sober to a point to where they could be released or go into treatment. David Hooper was a man who died in the early 70s in the Multnomah County Jail drunk tank, because back in the 70s, they just took people to jail who were drunk, put them in a cell until they sobered up. People oftentimes would die from, poor care. And after his death, there was a group of people got together and said, we need to do better for our intoxicated individuals. In the 70s, 80s, even the early 90s, when I was working on the streets, we were focused mainly on what we would call the old town chronic drunks. This is before when, fortified wine was sold down here, et cetera, et cetera. But we would take people to Hooper Detox. And in the 90s, the law enforcement, and this was tri-county wide, this wasn't just Portland, could bring people, 10 to 15,000 people a year who were intoxicated and unable to care for themselves, had a place to go to be able to be evaluated and to get sober. And sometimes there were treatment options. Sometimes they just walk out the door 4 to 6 hours later. Not an ideal system, but it was an option. In the as the pandemic, not the pandemic, but the opioid epidemic, increased use of meth and so forth materialized in the last 3 to 5 years, the population that was being taken to Hooper Detox became much more violent, much more difficult to serve. The model hadn't changed from when it was just chronic old town alcoholics. So we began to see an increased amount of violence toward staff. We saw an increased amount of self-inflicted violence. And so abruptly, at the end of 2019, the Hooper Detox Center closed. In 2019, law enforcement took about 5,000 people there, which does give, like I said, a momentary break in the system, in the behaviors. It's not a cure-all. When that closed in 2019, since 2020, and I've been part of it, working with the city and the county, trying to identify a solution, a replacement, but there isn't one. So once again, those defaults are either hospitals, jails, or unfortunately, a lot of first responders just walking away because they don't want to deal with either one of those. They don't see either one of them as effective. So we've seen almost a doubling of overdose deaths in the last couple of years. Now, that's not directly related to the closing of Hooper, but there's certainly some correlation between the lack of services available for first responders who encounter people who are intoxicated, unable to care for themselves. So the loss of a sobering center or a stabilization center has been very significant in the last couple of years.
So the complicating factors are lack of sufficient mental health facilities, lack of a detox center, which kind of sends us back to the old days of throwing somebody in the drunk tank in jail, where they might not survive, and that's not helping.
Yeah, I mean, when you have your two solutions for first responders, and your first responders have to be part of this conversation because they're the only organization that's 24/7. This is my bias towards law enforcement. I mean, there's a lot of great programs out there. There's a lot of fantastic outreach. There's a lot of boots on the ground, people doing tremendous work. But the reality is at 3 o'clock in the morning when it's 32 degrees outside, and the guy's standing in the middle of 2nd Main wearing socks and underwear, sweating profusely, swinging a baseball bat, they're going to call the police. And the police have very few options. The police can basically take that person into custody and take him to jail, maybe for some misdemeanor charge like disorderly conduct, which we know that the district attorney won't prosecute on. And yet, we've interrupted that cycle, or possibly, if available safely, take them to the ER. They go to the ER. Our ERs are not designed for this. They can handle it. I mean, they have the capability, but our ERs are designed for, the heart attack, the motor vehicle accident, et cetera. So when people come into the ER that are in crisis, either addiction or mental health, and meth has just skyrocketed in the last 3 or 4 years in our ERs, frankly, their role is to get them as stable as possible and then get them out the door. So sometimes that's 6, 8, 12, 14, 16 hours. The costs are incredible. It's our most expensive form of treatment, is to send somebody to an emergency room. It takes up needed beds for other high-level emergencies. So creating adequate spaces for first responders that are encountering these folks to be able to make decisions, use the tools they have legislatively and et cetera, would be very significant.
Okay, I think that's enough gloom and doom. I think we get it. Let's try to talk about some positive steps that are being taken now and further steps that we can take. I've been involved with RPC for several months now, and we've been talking about a game plan, and we think we've got some good platforms, and our website has a lot of good information. But then somebody pointed out Rich's op-ed in the Beaverton Valley Times back from March 23rd, 2022. I'm going to read a little bit from it because I was almost disturbed. Rich wrote, "What is a perfect solution to homelessness? A, plentiful, safe, and affordable housing options. B, enough well-trained caseworkers to assess and provide wraparound services tailored for each houseless person. C, easily accessible drug rehabilitation and mental health treatment. D, clean water, healthy food, and adequate medicine. E, services and education for homeless children. F, efficient coordination of all these resources so the people most vulnerable can have basic human needs met." I was disturbed because that's our plan, and we didn't actually think of it. Rich thought of it. Other people have thought of this. These aren't original ideas. We're not the only ones with these ideas. A lot of people have put these things together. So how do we get there? Alan, let's go back to you and please talk about your agencies, and especially Bybee Lakes, and what you guys are doing to try to help.
My story after being homeless for over 27 years was getting arrested, changing my life, starting an organization where we listen to people when they come in the door, and from scratch. Started a 9-bed facility in Seaside, Oregon, and now we are the largest homeless reentry program in the state. We do something different than everybody else. We have our own proprietary system called Tactical Demographics, where each person who comes through our door, we do a full evaluation of. We get their demographics, their needs, and the obstacles they face to reenter society. We take that information and we customize one reentry plan per person. So we provide emergency shelter when a person comes in the door. We offer them the longer-term program where we have beds, and that's what we do. Our organization has grown in that way because our success rate becomes higher when we invest in people to give them an opportunity to change their life. We have low barrier shelter on the front end of our program, and then we offer people high barrier programs, which means that you can't drink, you can't use, you got a program, and we'll help you do whatever it takes to overcome those obstacles. Just about 3.5 years ago, a friend of mine, Senator Betsy Johnson, called and said, hey, I got a good friend of mine who's tearing a building down in Portland. Would you be interested in the kitchen equipment? And I said, absolutely. You know, we've got some big kitchens, we would do that. And so I came down here, and I talked to Jordan on the phone for just a few minutes, came down, toured the facility, and I could not understand for the life of me why a 155,000 square foot building made for this was sitting there, and we had this problem happen. I must have drove past 400 homeless people on my way there. And I went in there, and it was all stripped down, and the only thing left in the kitchen was a 25-foot long dishwasher, and that wasn't going to work for me because our kitchens are 20-foot long. And decided this probably wasn't something that I could get involved in, but I could still not understand that. And a few months later, Jordan and Betsy were celebrity judges at an event that I was speaking at. And she asked if I'd like to meet Jordan. I said, absolutely, and went over and shook his hand. And he said, tell me your story. And I told him my story from beginning to end. We sat there in the middle of this room with hundreds of people around us, and he was just engaged, and he was passionate about this change. So we started to have conversations. He gave us a list of stuff to do. We went down to this facility, and we met all the goals that he set forth for us. But what we did understand was there was 12 or 13 agencies attempted to bring a facility to this building. This building now has 318 beds in it, a medical wing, a dental suite, a daycare center, mental health services, addiction services, all in one location, where today a person gets sent to our door. We just finished up a couple great projects in here to make sure that we can meet the needs of everybody coming through our door, no matter what it is. What if we can have the addiction services piece? What if we can have the mental health services piece? And it's not a fit for everybody, but having everything in one location makes a lot more sense, because I could not reach all the resources I needed to change my life if I had to go from this location to that location, to that location, to that location. So what we do is we do an individual reentry plan driven by data. We research the trauma that people have lived through in their life, and we customize plans to help them overcome those obstacles. 65% of the people that come into our emergency shelter move into reentry, and 80% of those people get put back into our communities with a toolbox for sustainability.
Rhetorical question. Yeah, amazing. Amazing. How much of this has been accomplished with government money?
None at first. I want to change that just a little bit. Is all of the fundraising we did was private donors. Jordan's massive donation for us to get this thing started here and work together to make that happen. And then, you know, when we brought our data to the table and we started accumulating data from here, the tone began to change, because we come to the door with data that nobody's ever seen before. And it started to change. So we recently got $1 million from the city. That took a lot of effort and kind of calling everybody out publicly. We have not received 1 penny from the county. We're not even allowed to apply to the county. And we received $2 million from the state to remodel the building.
So there's $599 million left to apply for, right?
Oh yeah, if
Okay.
we could just apply for that. But you know, we don't fit that category. Assisting people in changing their life is not a fundable process that happens with state or county or city money.
You know, Tom, I think it's important to tell you, I know you want to keep this positive, but I think it's important to say that I got involved with the land use issues in trying to get started out there at Bybee Lakes. And that was a huge hurdle to overcome. The systems simply aren't prepared to look at the alternative that Alan's offering at this point yet. I I mean, it's amazing that we've got $1 million from the city and $2 million from the state, but that should be 10 times that amount. And a part of it is because the politics just haven't caught up.
And again, yeah, trying to stay positive, trying not to malign too much, but what's the source of the opposition? Why so much opposition?
Well, there's a current that's been in place for years. I mean, some of these laws have been put into place since the 1960s. We collect data. You know, the first slide that came up on this thing a little while ago talked about the point in time count. And it talked about how we gather the information, how we gauge that point in time count, which is wrong. It's wrong, by the way. It's not accurate. It's never been accurate. I got some friends in here who understand that. The HMIS system is broken. It states that we collect enough information, and the people who deserve the help the most are the people who are on fire. People falling out of the system have to actually catch on fire to receive that assistance. It's all driven by money. And the problem is that this current that's been in place for so long is what's hard to change. You can't just come in with an idea and change the current. But we're trying, and that's how everybody here, and I want to stand up a minute, that's how everybody here can get involved, is what if we bring different, bigger groups of people, prominent people that come to the table and say, we need to look at this different. And let me give you an example. In the last 2 years, over $400 million has been put to solve the homeless problem that has got 15% worse a year in chronic homelessness. If we continue to do the same thing we've always done and we spend the money the same way we've always spent it, expecting a different result, that is the definition of insanity. And I know because I was clinically insane for years, and I still might be a little crazy. But we have to start looking at this problem differently, and it's driven by the way the data is collected, how the funding streams get released to cause the problems. And I'll give you another example. The problem gets worse. What do? We come up with a bond, and let's tax 10% of the people, not all of the people, and let's get that money and spend that money the exact same way that caused the problem to begin with.
Alan, you mentioned HMIS, right? That's the Homeless Management Information System that the counties and the cities use, correct?
And the state, correct.
And the state, okay. And that's used by the Joint Office of Homeless Services and the Portland Housing Bureau, developed by HUD. I went online to try to figure out what data they actually collect, and I couldn't tell. It looks like to me it's mostly housing-related data. Is that accurate, or do we know?
Well, there's a lot, and you're going to have a great presentation after us today, and I'm sure that they could give you a little bit of information on that too. I'll give you an example. So there's a system called VI SPDAT that gathers a ton of information on each individual person, and then there's a point system that says, I'm an intravenous drug user, I have mental health issues, I've been to jail, I've been to prison, I've been these things. It takes all of these numbers, and it says, you are the most important person in need right now. It's a point system that's put into place. That data was never utilized or usable for an organization like ours. So in Clatsop County, Community Action said, hey, we're going to give you $12,000 this year to house people in our county. But you have to feed this system called HMIS. So that year, I spent $18,000 on data entry to feed a system that was never usable data for our organization, to receive $12,000, and not a penny of that ever went to where it said it was going to go. Those are the problems that I see, the deeper issues, is it's driven for gauging how bad the problem is, and the problem gets worse every year. They release more money. It comes down to get spent the exact same way, and we get 15 to 20% increases in chronic homelessness every year.
What Alan's talking about is exactly what we ended up kind of seeing. First of all, let me say, that op-ed was not my personal op-ed. That was a group of the Jewish community, the Catholic community, the inner city Portland Christian community, the Muslim community, and we all worked together to come up with that. And that list of things was basically what we were hearing. But here's what happened. We put that out. We continued to listen. Alan was one of the early people that came to us, and we listened to Alan's story. We looked at this HMIS system, and it wasn't working. And then we found out about a thing called Built for Zero. I don't know if you've heard about Built for Zero. And initially we got really excited about Built for Zero. It was supposedly working around the country in about 100 different cities, mostly a little smaller than Portland. But the idea was they were collecting data. And we looked at that and we said, okay, what data? So I wrote this down. Who is experiencing homeless? What services are they or aren't they getting? Where can they find alternative housing that meets their needs? When will they be able to enter that housing if they do find it? And why can't they find it if they're not able to find it? Now, that requires, as Alan has talked about, individual people being known by the system and having data collected on them. There is tremendous pushback right now among a lot of our leadership in the state to being intrusive in people's lives by collecting that data. But our conclusion is, until we do so, we are never going to be able to get around this problem as a community.
Alan, I don't want to let go of Bybee Lakes quite yet. I think we've got some more to talk about. To the extent that you can share, how does your data collection compare to this HMIS system?
Well, our data is usable data that allows us to take a person's story and customize that into data so we can make sure that we can meet the needs of the person who comes through the door by listening to their story. Our data is their story. It's customizable for us, so we can individualize a plan for a person to overcome multiple obstacles staged from the emergency shelter portion to sustainable for housing, job placement along the way, vocational training, all of those things. That's kind of what makes us different. The HMIS system is utilized to gather data, and it was never usable that we could use it for us.
Your website, I'm going to harp on this stuff some more, so just continue, please. Your website mentions compassion and accountability. Can you describe what that means?
Absolutely. So in the 27 years I lived on the street, I never met one person who said, I want to be homeless. I never met one person who said, I want to be addicted. I never met one person. We have the community has this concept that people want to be where they're at, and that's not the truth. Compassion and accountability are the two things. What changed my life was accountability, and I applaud our police chief here that talked about the importance of consequences, because consequences allowed me to change my life. People want to be invested in. They don't want to be invested in to stay in the exact same place that they are. That's the difference, is if we can compassionately offer somebody services, and I'm going to say, hey, look, I'm going to fight for you, but you have to fight for yourself. If you stop fighting for you, I stop fighting for you. This is a deal and a handshake at the door. People truly want to change their life. They want the opportunity to be somebody. We have to invest in that the right way, compassionately, trauma-informed, and then hold them accountable to reach each one of those goals. You put those two things together and you build success.
Now, I think you described Bybee Lakes as a high barrier system, or is it a combination of high barrier and low barrier?
It's a full navigation center. It really is people who come to our door and get referred to us. There's 34% of those people we can't assist because their needs are higher than we're capable of helping them. Behavior is everything, and public safety and safety of our clients are the utmost importance. There are some people who are not quite ready to make that switch. I was one of those for years, because you want me to quit using drugs? When I quit using drugs, I remember the horror that I lived through when I was young. So it took me a long time to get in that position. It's really hard to explain, but yeah.
I have a lot of other topics to cover, and obviously we don't have a lot of time. I've been asked to ask people if they have questions to hold up their question cards with the questions, and those will be collected, and we'll have our panelists answer questions. Bob, I don't want you to throw a penalty flag at me, so Can you describe what the current state of law enforcement and its involvement in homelessness is to the extent that you're aware and you're involved?
Yeah, so I want to echo comments that both these gentlemen have made as they relate to criminal justice and law enforcement. And we talk about compassion and accountability. It's challenging, once again, because when you defer to law enforcement as your primary point of contact or primary tool, their options are limited. They largely are around arrest, and there's tremendous amount of risk and impact involved when we arrest somebody for everybody involved. But the reality is, the conversation is that, we're a nation of laws, and there's a certain level of predictability that comes with being able to operate in the public space. When you walk down the sidewalk, as I did this morning, and similar to Jordan's comments, there's an expectation that I should be able to park and walk down here safely. So there's a level of predictability we have in our society that is based largely upon many things, including the role of law enforcement. There's also things that were mentioned in that list, around housing and clean water, education. Other things fill in the public safety gap. It's not just regarding law enforcement or criminal justice. So I don't want to make it sound like that's the only answer. But because of a lot of the attitudes, approaches, beliefs, philosophies, whatever you want to call it, in the Tri-County area, and particularly in Multnomah County related to criminal justice, we've pulled more and more back away from that resource to be able to intervene in these actions. And even on a state level with Measure 110, for example, and the decriminalization of, small amounts of controlled substances. By the way, which generated $260 million, which still hasn't been adequately distributed to addiction services across the country. And if you look at the way OHA handled that, and I will malign somebody for a minute, it's just been absolutely deplorable. You can go online and watch the public meetings and the decision-making process. It was ridiculous. And there's that lack of accountability, even not just on the street level, but at the highest levels of our organization, for why that's allowed to happen. And we're talking, hundreds of millions of dollars for addiction treatment that's still not being dispersed. So, but the efforts we've made around decreasing the role of criminal justice and law enforcement to help mitigate some of these issues, behavior specific, has ultimately led to, a decline overall in the criminal justice system. So we know that, the police bureau has, lost several people over the years. We know the district attorney's office has not only seen less staffing, but DA Schmidt has taken a different approach to many of these lower level crimes. We know that the jail is, one of the things Multnomah County Jail prides itself on, or Multnomah County prides itself on, is the length of time people spend in jail. And when I was there in 2019, they're very proud of the fact that most people just spent, a handful of days in jail. The way that people cycle through the system so quickly, whereas in most major cities, people are in jail longer. If you go to jail, there must be a reason. Let's try and figure out what that problem is. The Multnomah County is, we want to get them out as soon as possible because jail is harmful. Now, there's a lot of studies out there that say you can't force people into treatment. I have met many, many people like Alan who say, jail saved my life. Literally, jail saved my life. But I'm not a proponent of saying we're going to use jail to get people off of drugs. We use jail for people who break the laws, whose behavior isn't in line with, et cetera, the expectations of the community. And once again, I don't want to make it sound like that's all done perfectly, but so many times in this county particularly, I've seen where we make perfect the enemy of good. We are trying to achieve a certain level of nirvana that's just not accessible because, once again, we're human beings. We're complicated. All of us are, from the person on the street to the mayor to the county chair, whoever it is. So I really think that our unwillingness to really invest, and not necessarily invest financially, but bringing law enforcement and criminal justice back into this conversation in an appropriate way has been a miss for us in the last few years. And some of that's on the police, with the hands-off approach the police have taken. Once again, I love my brothers and sisters in the police bureau, but there's definitely been a withdrawal from that standpoint. Some of it's lack of staffing, some of it's the community pressure, expectations, the messaging, the community saying what they do and they don't want from the police, DA decisions, et cetera, et cetera. But hopefully I answered your question, Tom. I kind of went down a rabbit hole there.
I know we have questions and we're bumping up against our time, but Rich, I was really amazed to read about your group, United in Spirit, and I appreciate you mentioning that at the end of your op-ed there's a list of groups. It's an amazing coalition. I can't believe it. And I also, from my research, have seen that churches play a real critical role in a lot of dealing with the homelessness issues. Can you talk a little bit about the role of churches and what they play in dealing with the issues?
We do have an amazing group of people that have been meeting now for the last couple of years, and we represent tens of thousands of members of our congregations. And I can tell you that every leader in this group constantly talks about the fact that people are ready to put out effort on behalf of those that they have compassion for. But the problem is this, and I hate to keep coming back to the problem, Tom. I served I served a while in the Oregon legislature, and I was in the wrong party, so I didn't have any leadership roles, or I didn't, have any real influence. But what I observed was that, for the most part, I was surrounded by really good people, and those people all wanted to do the right thing. But beginning with national politics, the polarization that had been created by our party politics essentially meant that they couldn't talk about these issues in a nuanced, complex way to get to a real solution, because it was too important to make sure that you were making your point on the edge where your constituents could understand and get behind you. So we got tens of thousands of parishioners that want to get involved, and yet every time we come in, and this is not 100% true. Steve Rallison sitting back here, he's with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints also, and he's been really good with Sister Veronica of the Archdiocese and others in bringing volunteers in to do cleanups and that sort of thing. But the reality is we've got very limited opportunities to help, because the politics don't want anybody involved that isn't part of this funding stream that Alan talked about. And that really often goes right back to this sort of political divide. So my hope is that a group like this, which I suspect is politically very diverse, can help us engage in that conversation that really does need to be complex and nuanced in order to address the kinds of problems that we're hearing about today.